Welcome to Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we discuss Trump 2.0's policies and politics and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. China's biotech industry is no longer just a copycat story. It is rapidly becoming one of the world's most important engines of medical innovation, with profound implications for patients, pharma, and policymakers in both East and West. China's decades of long-term state planning, investment in R&D parks, and regulatory reform, a huge patient pool, and a culture of fast experimentation have created a maturing ecosystem that now delivers world-class oncology, cell therapy, GLP-1, and AI-enabled drug discovery assets. Roughly 40% of recent global out-licensing deals now involve China-origin drugs, with Western pharma relying on Chinese assets for growth, even as US and European policymakers debate tariffs, data security, and China risks. So much so that the US Congress introduced Biosecure Act to restrict US federal government procurement and funding for biotech companies linked to foreign adversaries like China, aiming to secure the US biotech supply chain. In our very first episode of 2026, we're diving deeper into these important issues with Dr. Ruby Wang, a London-based surgeon and founder of Lindra's Health, who has worked on the front lines of health diplomacy at the British Embassy in Beijing and now advises global life sciences and health tech companies on China. Let's hear Ruby's perspective. So welcome, Ruby. It's wonderful to have you. I've been looking forward to this episode because of your expert knowledge on China, global health, and policies. So maybe you can share with us a little bit about your background, including your upbringings and your experience with health.
Thanks so much, Wenchi. As a background, I'm a practicing medical doctor based in London. I lead Lindra's Health, which is a strategy consultancy I founded. I advise life sciences, health tech, industry stakeholders, as well as think tank, policymakers, public sector, focusing on East and West, especially China in the West. So everything from policy to market access to product narrative, geopolitical risk. There's a lot going on in this space at the moment, so it's pretty exciting and really interesting. I also sit on the Royal Society of Medicine in the UK. We have a digital health council. So apart from my cross-border work, I'm quite closely involved with the UK health tech startup ecosystem, looking at what it takes clinically for health innovations to work for patients and doctors.
So I'm going to ask, you were trained in the UK as a medical doctor, and what took you or what interested you in terms of the world of China when it comes to health issues?
I was born in China, then I grew up in the UK. I trained and practiced here for a few years. And as I was starting as a resident doctor in the UK's National Health Service, I really enjoyed my job, but also there was just so many inefficiencies with the system from a policy point of view, from a management point of view, that I realised I couldn't help to solve as a frontline clinician. So I became increasingly interested in the higher level challenges. And at the same time, this was 10 years ago now, China was on the rise in 2016, so a lot in the media. And because it's my cultural and personal background too, I was just drawn to what was happening there, how China's grown, developed, matured in terms of its health impact, both domestically and around the world. And I think because of all of my cross-cultural background, being able to translate and bridge that narrative and bring those perspectives together has been really meaningful.
What interested you in health policies in general and public health? And what kind of doctor were you trained originally?
I originally trained in surgery. I still really I still love the idea of
Operating on people.
It's very satisfying and meaningful. And it's very, you get things done quickly. There are solutions. And I like the idea of delivering outcomes rather than watching and waiting, which is in internal medicine. You sort of give medicines and then wait a while. And if there are side effects, if it doesn't work, you try something else. So surgery is very satisfying with endpoints in mind. But after a few years as a resident doctor, and in that time I was working for the UK's Doctors Union as well, then I did another master's and then moved to Beijing, where I led the health team for the UK government for their foreign office at the British Embassy in Beijing. And this was during the pandemic. So it was quite an intense time for health diplomacy, health policy, and in terms of delivering technical programs engagement, really thinking about what can the UK and China do together to build stronger health systems, train doctors, improve regulatory standards. Even though this was only 5 years ago, at that time the direction was very much what can the UK show China in terms of how to regulate for medicines, in terms of how to train clinicians, how to build effectively a health ecosystem. But of course today what we're talking about is how much China's progressed rapidly to the point where a lot of these directions are either China's being equal to what's happening in the rest of the world in terms of health, or even surpassing now. So times change quickly, but that was 5 years ago when I went to China, start of the pandemic. And then before I came back, I also worked for a bit at the United Nations. But 3 years ago now, I've moved back to London.
Clearly, it shows that you're someone who's not limited to interested in the medical side of things, even though operating on people or surgeries, as you said, is like a quick solution. But you're also interested in bigger solutions, which is much harder and takes longer, which is what we really want to focus on today. So you have mentioned, I thought that was really interesting, even just 5 years ago, there was this attitude that UK is here to teach China, but in just a very short period of time, China seems to have progressed so much. Maybe you can help us understand. I'm sure it didn't happen just within 5 years, right? Like it must have been a long time, like every other sector China has been doing. They've just been doing it quietly for a long time. But it's not until more recently that we're seeing the, I would say, outcomes. So give us a review of what China has been doing in the medical field.
Yeah, I think exactly as you said, what seems new in kind of English media, Western narratives of, suddenly in the past 1 to 2 years, we see a lot of headlines about China's biotech rise. Has actually been going on for much longer, an exponential rise. And now 24, 25, we're seeing that peaking visibly and leading to outcomes and drug assets, so physical products that we can then judge as evidence for what China's progressed on in terms of biotech innovation. But as you've said, as with other sectors, China's biotech ecosystem has been developing for decades now, shaped by long-term policy vision, sustained investment from the state, whether that's building industrial R&D parks, tax incentives, support for industry at all levels, regulatory reform, infrastructure building. So holistic, long-term, resource-intensive support from the government side, patiently building what is now a maturing ecosystem.
Would you say they started, thinking about these kind of long-term planning? Was there anything that kind of prompted them to do that? When did they start?
I mean, this goes back to the 80s. Even Deng Xiaoping, he was going on visits abroad and visiting Chinese cities, rural areas, seeing what foreign industry was doing and wanting to bring that back home. But through various iterations and policy initiatives, building block by block more funding, more investment, and more experimentation. The sense that in China there's a sustained policy support and resource support, but also a flexibility to adapt. So what doesn't work, you let it dissolve quietly, and then you further support what is successful to pilot at regional level and then scale it up. So a lot of instances it was top-down central policy support, but then also bottom-up. If this one region or province was delivering in a successful way, then other regions might look to do similar things and implement also. And so iterating year on year, 5-year plans, building on that more strongly. And, more recently, we've seen biotech officially labeled as a high-quality productive force alongside semiconductors and AI. So really distinctively labeling this sector as a priority, which then of course keeps important channels open, keep all levels of stakeholders invested in supporting this area. So all of this long-term holistic push, it's quite unique to China. It's associated with the way the politics is run and the governance is, and the idea that you're You're not a democratic, political system which tailors to voter cycles and short election turnarounds. You can do this because this is the way China is set up. Because biotech is such a specialist sector, you cannot just build something overnight. It does need that amount of time. But I do think that even though what China's done has taken longer than people might realize, it's still incredibly fast. Only, 2-3 decades, and we've come to where it is today. Whereas the mature ecosystems we see in the West have taken much longer since the 40s, 50s, and so on. So it's still incredible, not only the pace, but the scale. And I think other important reasons for biotech in particular is that China's vast population means that the patient pools to, create, design, implement clinical trials, simply there's more volume. There's also lower cost because China, is cheaper and more efficient in many ways. And then increasingly, as we look towards the next years, I think we're only going to see this continue to increase because, we'll talk about a bit later, the digital infrastructure that China's building, helping to accelerate all of this even further.
So you have mentioned that biotech is viewed as a strategic sector alongside with semiconductors and AI. Do you know why China sees that as such a strategic sector?
For me, my personal opinion is that biotech is important for domestic capability and resilience. It is very important that you can produce good quality medicines for your own population. The pandemic only emphasized this more. We realized as global supply chains were breaking down, the importance of building domestic resilience has become ever stronger. So I think China is driving its own biotech sector mostly for itself rather than intentionally as an area of global strategic competition.
It's actually quite similar to many other sectors we're seeing. China seems to have realized for a long time it's dependent on foreign technology, expertise, knowledge, skills to build up its own domestic capability. But in the end, like many countries today, they really want to make sure it's not a vulnerability, but how to develop their own resilience. So you have talked about now China, especially with technology, is helping it, enabling it to develop some of the more cutting edge biotech. So what are they? Like how advanced are they today?
I think overall, China is now fundamentally strong where speed and ability to iterate and execute matter. So its biotech ecosystem is now functioning across an entire spectrum. What it was known as was kind of copycat, Me Too drugs. That still exists. That's still strong. So the ability to support basic products, low-cost generics, is still there. But now there's a spectrum up to more advanced R&D capability and, what is now genuinely world-class innovation. I would say some key areas, so oncology, cancer therapies, particularly some of the more complex biologics like ADCs, biospecific antibodies. Chinese firms are, now going to international conferences, publishing abstracts, trials with globally competitive data, first-in-class, best-in-class assets. And again, because of the big patient populations we mentioned, and now increasingly a strong engineering capacity for chemistry, antibody engineering, learn and iterate cycles. Cell therapies are another really strong area, like CAR T, especially as its regulatory capability has increased alongside the ability to scale manufacturing well and do clinical trials rapidly. And this is quite frontier and innovative, but because China's got this adaptability to experiment and has quite a well-knit health ecosystem between hospitals and providers and industry, and then cost advantages in manufacturing. And then another area which is a bit more recent is kind of the metabolic and the GLP-1s. So China's not the originator. We've got Novo Nordisk and Lilly in this space kind of dominating the market and globally. But going back to what we were saying about China being a very efficient copier, I think because of that baseline, it's an increasingly competitive second wave, which matters commercially. And so we should look at China's GLP-1s not as kind of a copycat sector really, but, its own innovator and GLP-1 or even related metabolic pathways, different types of strategies. And because China's got huge domestic competition, that's the way the landscape operates, then that driver is pushing this area to become increasingly competitive. And then I think another more kind of ecosystem reason is kind of AI-enabled drug discovery and development. Again, I think this area is always kind of a hyped area, a lot of kind of hashtag AI and drug development going on, a lot of questions on who is actually using LLMs, AI effectively in drug R&D. That is questionable. Even when on our Global Women Asia Summit recently in Boston, when we visited the Whitehead labs at the MIT Institute, I was asking some of the scientists there, do you use AI in your, research? And they kind of said, we are a little bit. We want to make sure we've got skin in the game, but we're not really doing it as our priority or centering our strategy to drive efficiency and cost. But I think, again, this is where China is doing it, is trialing, is experimenting. And because this is the character of how China operates, I predict China's going to move much faster in this space because it's willing to experiment.
It sounds like they do have the very strong talent pipeline. Where are they vis-a-vis the top tier in the world right now?
Yeah, really strong talent capability. Some returnees from abroad in the past decades, but increasingly many of, the key scientists, the CMOs in these biotech companies in China, they've never trained abroad. They've domestically developed talent in Chinese universities. So that capability is building steadily and rapidly. Even when China's building category-defining assets, it's outcompeting what's already existing in the world, perhaps. But in terms of entirely novel disease biology, China still lags a little bit behind the West because that requires more decades of cumulative science. But again, everything we've said today already, that exponential acceleration, we're probably going to see that change in the next few years.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing that across the board. I think China has learned a ton from the Western world. There's a lot of media talking about how much of Western pharmaceutical companies depend on Chinese manufacturing. Is that still the case, or what are the relationships in terms of the big pharmas and Chinese companies now?
Yeah, there's been a lot of change. So in 2025, about 40% of the, global out-licensing deals was, China origin assets, which is an incredible increase from 5 years ago. It was in the single digits, so maybe
what does that mean, like licensing assets?
40% of those drug assets are from China. So it means that China's creating a lot of original excellent innovations that foreign big pharma companies have identified as good quality, and they want to partner and bring them overseas. So it essentially means that the technical experts, which are the biopharma companies, who are driven by a need to find the best innovation and make money from it, are seeing 40% of that coming from China this year.
And that is from the ideas to all the way to manufacturing of drugs, or like
It's
which
when
part of
when the asset is already gone through a certain, it can be phase 1 to 3, but it will be in trial form and de-risked and readily trusted to be a good enough asset to take abroad. We've seen billion-dollar deals with AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Merck. I think in spring and summer, every few weeks there was a new massive deal, big, Western MNC with a Chinese biotech asset.
So in that case, would you say China's almost serves like a medical lab?
I guess you could say increasingly so. It's a huge source of innovation and is only set to continue innovation propels itself, right?
So innovations come from China, supplying 40% of the drug ideas, and then American companies or European companies have a licensing deal with them and bring their, innovations to other parts of the world. Is that how the business model works right now?
Yeah, so the main business model is China rights or ex-China rights. So taking that asset abroad because, science is only one part of the pathway for a drug to get to a patient and save a life. It's actually the easiest part, in my opinion, as a clinician. And so I'm not a lab person. So all of my consulting is about how to get that drug into the market to the patient via the providers. And it's really tough because it's completely dependent on that country's health system, their regulatory capability, their version of the FDA, their reimbursement system, their public insurance infrastructure, provider capability, doctors' education, patient awareness. And also that specific disease will bring its own challenges in terms of if it's a chronic disease that needs daily treatment, if it's a cancer therapy with an end in sight. All of those factors hugely impact what it means for that drug to get to a patient. And we're not even talking here about the costs too. So the US market being a lot more pricier compared to other countries. So all of these factors impact how a drug gets to a patient in a country. And this is why a lot of these Chinese biotech companies, yes, they might be strong in science research and development now, but they, of course, don't know how to work the US health system, right? So they need help to do that. These foreign pharma, who obviously have all this experience, are the ones to help them do that. And they'll work out this deal where the ex-China rights means they get a cut, but the core asset is from China.
That is truly fascinating. So, do you think when those companies develop those drugs, do they have the global market in mind or how to partner with those pharmaceutical companies? Because in the very beginning, you did say China was primarily thinking about its own domestic market.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think increasingly so. So, China's biotech companies, not that the intention matters, but when they started developing, of course, they focused on the China market, which is already huge. There's a push factor and a pull factor. So, the pull factor is if they're good enough for the world, why not try? You can make more money, you can access more patients, save more lives. And if other companies can help you to do that, then of course that's great. There's an important push factor though here, which is that China's health ecosystem and its policy priorities is to promote affordable access to services and medicines for its population. And so China's drug market, the pricing is very low. Whether you're a foreign company or a Chinese company, in order to access the majority public health ecosystem and the majority of China's patients, you need to get onto something called the National Drug Reimbursement List. It's the necessary door that needs to be opened. But when you get on that list, your drug price is cut usually an average of 60 up to 90%. So if your drug ends up being a tenth of the price you aimed for it to be for, the viable model is VBP, which is volume-based procurement. So the idea that if you sell enough volume, the low margins are still worth your while. For, young Chinese biotechs, this feels risky and difficult. And even though they've had this support from China's state in terms of resource and everything and funding to build to where they are today, China's domestic market might not be enough to get them the returns they want. And if they can sell this drug for 10x the price in the US in particular,
Of course they would do
and
it.
they're very attracted to go abroad and try to do that. There are some Chinese biotech companies which might be globally listed, on the NASDAQ or whatever. They might have foreign executives in their team, and they're very smart and they're looking to de-risk and future-proof from the outset and looking to fundraise enough so that when they're designing trials and pipelines early, they're already building their own manufacturing capability, maybe in the US, so that they don't need to rely on a foreign pharma. But, you need to be very confident and you need to have the internal capability to even try to do that because it's very difficult.
I have several follow-up questions. First, I've also heard that you don't make a lot of money by selling drugs to China. So that clearly is intentional because I think the government, has a different philosophy, really wants to make sure their people have access to healthcare. But do you think the government might change the business model in the future in order to make sure their domestic drug producers, manufacturers, and biotech companies get to stay in China, number one. Number two, especially given today's geopolitical climate, there's a lot of talk in the US about not going to rely on China's pharmaceutical manufacturing, trying to bring pharma back in the US. So you see some recent announcements as well, investing in the US, producing drugs here. I would think from the Chinese point of view, would they worry about it?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So the first one about what's happening in China, because there's this conflict, right? This, from a health policy point of view, wanting to build a strong, healthy society which can access affordable, low-cost healthcare versus being able to support this flourishing biotech sector. I've thought about this a lot. I don't have an answer. I think it is a conflict. Partly because I think
Healthcare, should that be free? Yeah, I mean, that's a global debate. Yeah.
It's a global debate, and also the remit and the accountability for those two sectors are quite different ministries. They'd never conflicted before. Honestly, China probably didn't expect its own biotech sector to do so well. For the contrast to happen already in 2025. But we'll have to see what happens. And I think next March in the 15th five-year plan, we'll be able to, I'll certainly be decoding all of the messages and
Please do help us understand
what's happening there. I would say that from a health system point of view, we are seeing a slow change where there's signals of supporting the private health sector in various ways. And I think this comes from a realization from China top down that the population is huge and there are huge inequalities in society, rural to urban. But whilst we want to reduce the inequalities, at the same time, if parts of the population can afford and want to pay for top-tier expensive care, we can let them do it. And it will actually lessen the overall burden on the system, which can maybe in turn actually support the populations in need. And in most health systems today, we do see a mixed model ecosystem. The UK is obviously, majority free healthcare, but it's fragmenting for a reason. The US isn't really a great model to emulate, but mixed model system is probably more likely in the future. And one of the key signals we're seeing with this is the reimbursement list I mentioned earlier. In July, there was an announcement for a commercial drug reimbursement list. So a separate pathway through which, as a drug company, you can add your drug onto this list that can be reimbursed through commercial insurance. So, and other various policies I've been tracking, support for foreign hospital licensing, allowing private hospitals to build and flourish. So in terms of the geopolitical side of things, we're seeing in the West, especially the US, in terms of pharma tariffs, it was up in the air for a long time because in terms of history, pharma was the sector you do not tariff ethically. There was a World Trade Organization agreement that this is the one sector you don't tariff because medicines are important as a global good. But, Trump was threatening to overthrow that. So we were all nervously watching, I think, especially over the summer, and that went up and down and so on. But I think the longer standing piece about China origin drug assets goes before tariffs. So there was the Biosecure Act, which was on the table for a long time, still kind of a threat that is floating around. There was Trump's threat of a executive order, again targeting China origin biotech assets. There's a big difference between what political leaders are wary of and fearful of in terms of China-US competition versus what the scientists and what the industry players are wanting. Logically, yes, it's good to, same as what China's done, maintain domestic capability, reduce external dependence. I think everyone agrees that's not a bad idea. It's obviously not great for the big pharma companies, which have throughout the decades figured out the cheapest supply chains, which zigzag all around the world, and for them to have to move back manufacturing to the US, it's going to cost them billions, but they've committed to that because I think they recognize this is what's happening in the long term.
Yeah.
So better to do that faster rather than wait later. But at the same time, I think from an innovation point of view, it's a bit less logical. When I was in Boston last month, I had quite a few catch-ups with the academics. And, I was in Kendall Square, where a lot of the innovation is. And there was this kind of strange idea floating around that from a political perspective, a reason to clamp down on Chinese biotech innovation entering the US was to protect US biotech innovation. But that's not how science works. Right? You don't help yourself become stronger by shutting someone else. Science is collaborative. Science doesn't occur in silos. It's kind of irrelevant whether China's there or not, whether you have the internal capability, whether you have good enough labs to innovate the best assets. All it ends up doing is shutting the US out.
What does that mean if you could give an example? Some people may say, well, the US has been leading or the UK has been leading in many ways. So why do we need to share our scientific findings and discoveries with other countries? And I think that is kind of based on the assumption that they're the best, right? But essentially what you're saying is for the advancement of science, you need to collaborate. Is it because there are better ideas out there?
That's part of the reason. So the idea that regardless of these executive orders, scientists around the world are still going to be publishing papers in global journals.
That's how they learn. Is that that's
yeah,
how they
well,
learn?
yeah, that's you need peer reviews, and that's how the scientific landscape works. But the real risk is that if Chinese drugs, good quality, life-saving drugs that don't exist in the US, are not able to reach American patients, then the people losing out are the patients. Science and healthcare is not a competition. It's a shared global challenge.
What are the concerns from Washington, D.C.? Is it just purely business competition or there's something else more like the data, privacy concern?
All of those are reasonable factors. The worry of IP risk.
IP concerns, I think everyone gets it, right?
Yeah.
There's patient data or population data. There are like more national security kind of concerns. Most people today, I honestly don't care that much about data. I think medical is a little bit different. So the question is, are we so concerned about China somehow exploiting data? Those companies somehow will be able to exploit, or are we more concerned about saving people's lives? I don't know. Do we have to make a decision? Is there like a super drug from China that is gonna save lives and somehow cannot enter the US? Like I feel like we're not at that point yet, so we're just making a lot of assumptions.
Because I come from a clinical background, so I'm always thinking about the clinical side of things. But because I've worked in government, I see and I understand why these fears arise. And we kind of saw this during the pandemic, right? What logically makes sense for healthcare, for patients and populations, and for scientific progress, somehow it doesn't really land sometimes, and it clashes with politics.
Anything new like that, nobody knows, right?
Yeah, so the idea of China risk, which is always there and sometimes more justified in certain sectors than others, we must, pay attention to it and recognize it and try to mitigate sensitivities. But my perspective is that when it comes to healthcare and biotech, the overall shared goals are, patient outcomes. And so it is a shame when these pieces clash. The wish is that they did less because the logic is that there are greater needs to be met, that somehow security risks and fears override often.
Let's talk about AI. You also previously mentioned that AI is pretty much now embedded in China's life sciences. How are they using AI?
I've been looking a lot at the digitization of China's health ecosystem, and I see it being a lot more advanced and a lot more mature than many other countries around the world, whether that's
In
from
what way?
whether that's from electronic medical records, so transitioning infrastructure and record management from offline to online for operational efficiencies, or whether that's for diagnostics and therapeutics, which might be more high tech, virtual reality, surgical robots, LLMs, imaging diagnostics, and things like that. So again, similar to biotech, a spectrum of more basic technology versus the truly innovative frontier of, what's happening in AI. And I think a lot of it is to do with what we mentioned about this holistic, ecosystem support, as well as the characteristics of experimentation, trial and failure being very much accepted, and a very competitive ecosystem where industry tests itself and, thrives or fails and keeps going and iterates. And then the wider state and policy landscape supporting that drive. But also, I think a key part of China's digitization, especially in healthcare, which is the sector hardest to, digitize because of the ethics of it. You can't just trial, an AI in healthcare like you can in education or fintech, because when lives are at stake, you need to be a lot more careful. But even in China, there's a lot faster progress because the attitude towards data and privacy is quite distinctive in China, right? So whether it's the population or leadership, I think this goes back to a long-standing cultural context, Confucian attitudes towards the individual versus the collective, then kind of the communist mentality of, and even like the family hierarchy, where what one person has a right to in terms of privacy is just not viewed as a priority compared to in the West, where freedoms and independence is so strongly held as a moral right and a need for a person.
And also, that's definitely coming from the cultural background. And someone else also said it. I thought it was so appropriate. She said, if you look at the Chinese over the last 3 to 4 decades, every change has been relatively positive to the society as a whole. So people are used to the idea that, okay, changes happen fast and usually brings positive impact to society. So people are not afraid of change, right? People actually embrace change. Whereas it may not be the same in other parts of the world. That's why I think we see very little talk of fear around AI or any advanced technology. Would you say that's the attitude? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And also, in a country where the population is big, efficiency and convenience is a priority. Scanning your face to buy your groceries is seen as a convenience and a great thing to have, whereas in the West that would be met with shock and horror.
So in some way, that country market society is almost like built for this kind of new tech experiments.
One interesting distinction is that whilst China's attitude towards data privacy, it's almost like the state has access to the population's data, and that's kind of a given in a way that many Western nations view as not acceptable in their own countries, really. Cross-border is another matter. So China is very protective of its population's data, to the point where this really impacts digital health companies trying to access China's market or bring back out products, because the cross-border data transfer, especially for more sensitive materials like genetic data, it's just impossible to go overseas.
But why would there be a need for cross-border data sharing?
Well,
is it more like developing drugs that need maybe Chinese samples, or?
So, for example, if you're a foreign health tech company, it's impossible to access China's market. You can't bring your AI software and bring it into China, do it effectively, and then share that data back to your home-based cloud ecosystem in the US.
What about in other countries? What are the practices? Like, for example, can a UK biotech company come to the US and vice versa?
Yes. Well, this is less about biotech, which is why I felt like it's less relevant. It's because biotech, you can control it easily. You do bridging trials abroad. But in terms of more AI health companies, this is more relevant.
It's interesting to see what is okay and what is not okay in general. So clearly, I think patient data is viewed as almost like a national security concern,
Yeah,
right?
for all countries.
For all
Yeah.
countries, that is the same.
Yeah, which it should be. And Europe is very strong in regulating GDPR and lots of regulatory mechanisms in place. But the worry is that when you over prioritize privacy and these regulatory pieces, it comes at the risk of stifling important progress in healthcare, kind of like the frog in the boiling pot situation, where you're so worried about future potential risk, you're not addressing current health challenges in the most effective way, potentially.
It's always trying to find the right balance. I've heard that China somehow has created this Hainan Island, the southernest part of China, to be this medical paradise. Have you heard anything about it?
China's pushing for Hainan to be a region of medical tourism very strongly. So within kind of the Southeast Asia region, trying to build that out, plugging a lot of resources over there,
What does that
definitely.
mean, medical tourism? Like the most advanced medical services? What's being offered there? And what is the intention of building it as a medical tourism center?
Geographically, it's a strategic place to build strength in that sector. Medical tourism just means people traveling to that place from outside. It can be within China, from another province, it can be from another country to access health services, whether they are cheaper or better. So it will be a whole spectrum of what's offered. Might be top tier therapies, options, surgeries. It might just be faster pathways and a more integrated clinical ecosystem that lets you access the right points of care in a more efficient way.
It sounds like there's going to be another special zone where they can, have all kinds of experiments without the same regulatory limitation in other parts of China, which is also very typical for China to do. What do you think are the biggest misunderstandings in Western policy debates about China's biotech rise?
I think the main misunderstanding is still the idea we talked about at the start of Chinese biotech being low quality. That is still persisting. When I talk to industry insiders, we're talking about these high quality assets, but then when I resurface and go into the real world, people are still surprised that China's doing more than copycats and generics, and APIs. So that reputation still has a long way to go. And I guess it's understandable. It's only been a few years. So the mindsets need to update. It's important because today we haven't talked too much of the investor side of things, but biotech investors who are in the know but don't know China will have perceptions and narratives around what it means to be a Chinese asset. The brand trust piece will then influence sentiment, which then drives capital investment, which then impacts innovation
Whole
opportunities.
system, sure. Yeah.
So that whole ecosystem and the narrative discount, that's really important in that whole landscape. I would say another misunderstanding is what we talked about, just the only viable policy response to decouple rather than to collaborate in terms of making sure you protect sensitive areas, but then making sure there's continued engagement where in health and science and biotech, clearly there is so much benefit and shared goals of disease burdens and global health challenges. So those would be the main misunderstandings. And then in terms of opportunities, I think what we know is that China's position in the global biotech landscape is now undeniable and inevitable, that it's only going to continue to play a bigger role and be part of a bigger footprint. So then what can you do, whether you're UK or Europe or the US to respond, to best protect and then also strategically find the best opportunities. For Europe, maybe it's that regulatory piece we just talked about, building on this strategic advantage of regulatory excellence, the rigor and the safety and the efficacy, the trust that's been built in these institutions, and how to bring that to the table to make sure what are Chinese assets, which can be beneficial for global populations, are regulated in the best way so that we can all benefit, are made cost effective in the right ways. And then I think
And is that happening, to your understanding? That kind of conversations, is that happening right now?
I wouldn't say, it's hard to know because the responsibilities are so fragmented. It's like a whole ecosystem of actors. It not only takes the regulatory bodies, but it takes governments, it takes diplomacy, all of these conversations.
But
I
in
think
the private sector, I assume it's already probably more conversations, right?
Yeah, I think this is the important piece, right? Industry and the private sector, driven by technical outcomes, driven by revenue, they're going ahead. These deals are actively happening, only set to rise. But what's been held back is from the governance side, how the security risks we talked about. So there's this gap happening, and what can we do to reduce that gap?
Absolutely. Yeah. It partially is just educating the policymakers so they're up to date about what's really happening.
What's important to remember is the world is not made up of China and the West. There are all these developing countries needing good quality, affordable medicines for rising disease burdens. In the African continent, they're not only dealing with traditionally regarded developing country diseases like HIV, infectious disease, but also rise in cancer, obesity, heart disease. So the world, more so than ever, needs better medicines. What China's bringing to the table can maybe help solve some of those challenges. So then what can the West do to make sure regulations, accountability is happening? All levels of collaboration, not just industry side or policy side. And that's really hard because it's a fragmenting landscape. Aid is reducing, rivalries and inward facing narratives are on the rise. So it's really tough.
With that, well, thank you so much, Ruby. You're not only an active contributor to the thinking, but I know you will do bigger things in the future, hoping to change the system. So thank you. I really appreciate your sharing with us today.
Thank you so much, Wenchi. Great to be here.
Decades of long-term planning, massive investment, and a huge patient base have turned China into a biotech powerhouse. What does that mean for Western pharma and global supply chains? And how can governments balance national security concerns with the need for life-saving cross-border collaboration in science and medicine? This is Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we analyze the policies and political strategies of Trump 2.0 and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Thank you for watching and listening. We value your feedback. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast. See you next time.